Imagine yourself settling into bed. The lights are dim, your body finds its place in the mattress, and you let your mind drift far away from the noise of the present day. Tonight, we will travel back in time, centuries into the past, to a world that feels impossibly distant, yet one that shaped the very roots of our society. It is the medieval age, not the glittering castles of knights in shining armor, not the grand battles sung by poets, nor the golden feasts that legends love to recall. No, we are going somewhere else, into the soil, into the mud, into the homes of the ordinary people who lived beneath all of that splendor. We are going into the life of the medieval peasant. As your breathing slows, imagine yourself in rough linen clothing, the fibers coarse against your skin. Imagine a woolen cap pulled tight over your hair, not for style, but for warmth. The year is perhaps 1250, though it hardly matters. Time here passes not in dates or names, but in the rhythm of the seasons. And in this life, there is no comfort in waking, and no true rest in sleeping. There is only labor, obligation, and survival. Picture a village, a cluster of small huts with thatched roofs that sag under the weight of winter frost. The walls are made of wattle and daub, a lattice of wooden sticks covered with a mixture of clay, straw, and mud. Inside, it is dim. The only light comes from the low fire that fills the air with smoke. Your eyes sting, your lungs burn gently with every breath, and the smell clings to your clothing, never truly leaving. The bed is not soft. It is straw laid on the floor, crawling with lice and sometimes rats. The blanket is rough wool, heavy, damp with the cold that seeps in through the cracks. When you sleep, you do not dream of luxury, you dream of a day when your body is not aching, when your hands are not raw, when the hunger in your belly has quieted. You wake before dawn. The rooster calls, though perhaps you are already awake from the cold. You slip your feet into worn leather shoes, patched and repatched by hand. The chill bites at your skin as you step outside. The village is silent except for the faint bleating of sheep and the whisper of wind over the fields. The day ahead is not one of choice. Your labor belongs to your lord. The man who rules the manor, whose stone house towers over your village, dictates what you must plant, what you must give, and how much of your harvest will be taken. Out of 10 sacks of grain, perhaps only 2 will remain for you and your family. The rest goes to taxes, rents, and tithes for the church. The rhythm of your life is the rhythm of the land. Spring is for plowing and sowing, summer for tending crops, autumn for harvest, and winter for struggling through scarcity. There is no escape, no vacation, no pause in the cycle. If your family falls ill, the land does not wait. If your child dies, the field does not grieve. The food is simple, repetitive, and often inadequate. Bread made from coarse barley flour, dark and heavy, thin potajan, unremarkable stew of grains and whatever vegetables you have managed to grow. Meat is rare, a luxury for festivals or in times of slaughter. More often, it is cheese, eggs, and occasionally fish. If the river is kind, hunger is constant, gnawing at your ribs like a quiet but persistent animal. When illness comes, there is little hope. The village healer might mix herbs, the priest might mutter prayers, but disease spreads fast in close quarters. Fevers, coughs, stomach sickness, they carry people away as swiftly as the wind carries leaves. There are no hospitals, no doctors as you know them today. You live, you sicken, or you die, and always the work continues. Picture yourself in the fields. The soil is heavy, the wooden plow drawn by an ox that strains under the weight. You walk behind, guiding it through mud that clings to your feet. Your hands grip rough wooden tools, hoes, sickles, scythes worn, smooth by generations before you. Each movement is deliberate, exhausting, endless. By midday, your muscles tremble. By nightfall, you are broken, but you rise again the next day. Clothing is limited. A tunic of rough cloth, patched again and again. A belt of rope or leather. Shoes, if you are fortunate. In the cold, you wrap yourself in wool. In the heat, you sweat and burn beneath the sun. The nobleman, passing by on horseback, glitters in fine cloth. But for you, the fabric is always the same, rough, plain, and practical. Your world is not your own. The church bells call you. The Lord commands you. The seasons rule you. Even your family life is bound by survival. Marriages are arranged early, often as early as 12 or 14. Children are many, but few survive into adulthood. The cycle repeats itself, generation after generation, bound by duty and necessity. Imagine the evenings, after the fields, after the animals are fed, after the tools are put away, you return to your hut. The fire is low, the stew thin. You sit with your family, tired eyes staring into the flames. The children play with wooden toys or stones, their laughter faint but brief. Outside, wolves howl in the distance. Inside, you wonder if the winter stores will last. This is not a story of great victories or noble deeds. It is the story of countless unnamed lives, woven together by hardship. The story of men and women who bent their backs, who endured hunger, who carried the weight of kingdoms on their shoulders without ever knowing their names would be forgotten. And yet, in this darkness, there is endurance. The peasant does not live for glory, but for survival. And in survival, there is its own quiet form of triumph. As the seasons shift, so too does the rhythm of your life. You are not a person with freedom, but a body within a cycle, moving at the pace of the earth. In spring, the air is damp, heavy with the scent of thawed earth and new growth. It is the time of plowing, and the oxen groan under the weight of wooden yokes. You rise before the sun, your breath clouding in the morning mist. The soil is sticky, clinging to your boots, and each step is slow. You walk the same furrows your father walked, and his father before him. The sound of the plow cutting into the earth becomes like a heartbeat, steady, repetitive, endless. Summer brings its own challenges. The sun is hot, merciless, beating down on your back. You bend for hours, pulling weeds, cutting hay, tending to animals. The air hums with flies, the sweat runs into your eyes, and your skin burns beneath layers of dust. If a storm comes, it is both blessing and curse. The rain nourishes the crops, but too much can drown them. Your entire life depends on whether you cannot control, and every day you lift your eyes to the sky, hoping, fearing. Autumn is the busiest. The harvest season, your hands move until they are numb, cutting, gathering, bundling. The days grow shorter, but your work stretches long into the dusk. There is urgency in the air. What you bring in now will decide how your family eats through the winter. The grain must be threshed, the hay stored, the animals slaughtered for meat. The smell of smoke and drying herbs fills the village. It is a season of both abundance and worry, for you know how quickly abundance can vanish. Then comes winter. The fields lie empty, the ground frozen hard. Life is drawn indoors. Huddled around the fire, it is a season of hunger, of waiting, of fearing what little is left in storage. The stew grows thinner, the bread smaller. You count the sacks of grain again and again, each time hoping they will somehow last longer. Children shiver, old men cough, and sometimes the sound of crying pierces the silence of night when sickness claims another soul. Winter is not a season to be endured, it is an enemy to survive. Even children are not spared. From the time they can walk, they are put to work. Little hands carry water, herd geese, gather firewood. A boy of 6 may already swing a stick at stray animals, while a girl of 8 learns to spin wool or mend clothing. Childhood, as you think of it today, does not exist. There is only training for the burdens of adulthood, a gradual initiation into labor. And yet, through it all, belief sustains you. The church is the center of village life, a small stone building or even a simple wooden chapel, where the priest speaks in Latin words you cannot fully understand. Still, the rituals are familiar, the ringing of bells, the scent of incense, the murmurs of prayer. You cross yourself when you wake, when you eat, when you sleep, hoping that unseen forces will guard your fragile life. Superstition is as real as faith. You avoid the forest after dark, for spirits are said to dwell there. You hang herbs above your doorway to ward off illness, and sometimes whisper charms against the evil eye. A strange noise in the night could be a witch, a shadow in the field could be a demon. In a world where explanation is scarce, imagination fills the gaps, and fear is a companion as constant as hunger. Even moments of joy are fragile. On feast days, the village gathers, laughter mixing with music from simple flutes or drums. Ale flows, bread is shared, perhaps a pig is roasted if fortune allows. For a few hours, you forget the weight of the Lord's taxes, the endless labor, the gnawing hunger. Children dance, men sing, women clap their hands to the rhythm. And yet, when the fire burns low and the night deepens, the cycle begins again. Work waits at dawn. The soil does not forgive delay. This is your life. Not chosen, not questioned, but endured. Each day bleeds into the next. Seasons blend, and years pass unnoticed, until one winter you do not rise again, and the land takes you back, just as it always has. When the day's labor is done and the tools are laid aside, you return to the small space you call home. It is not just a shelter, but the heart of your family, though to modern eyes, it may feel more like a stable than a house. Inside there is a single room shared by all. The floor is packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw to soften the hardness beneath your feet. Chickens may wander in and out, and in winter the animals are often brought inside at night. Their warmth helps to keep the cold at bay, though it also fills the air with a pungent mix of smells: hay, smoke, damp wool, and the sour tang of manure. Family life is as constrained as the hut itself. You, your spouse, your children, perhaps even an elderly parent, all share this space. Privacy is unknown. The sound of breathing, the shuffle of feet, the murmur of whispered prayers, these are constants in the night. Life is lived collectively, for better and for worse. Marriage is less about romance and more about survival. You marry young, often in your early teens, because an extra pair of hands means more labor for the fields. A daughter may be given in marriage as soon as she is able to bear children, not because of choice, but because of necessity. Love may come later, or not at all. What matters is that the family line continues, that children are born, that there are enough workers to keep the household alive. Children are both joy and sorrow. You cradle them in your arms, you hear their laughter in the fields. You watch them chase geese or play with wooden dolls carved by a brother, yet you also know the fragility of their lives. Many will not survive past the age of 5. Illness, hunger, accidents, any of these can carry them away. When a child dies, grief is heavy, but there is little time to mourn. The soil still demands to be worked, the animals still need feeding. Life presses forward, indifferent to your pain. Food is the thread that binds each day. The table, if you can call it that, is a wooden board laid across supports. Upon it are the staples of your existence: bread, coarse and dark, often flavored with the grit of millstones that ground the grain; pottage, a thin stew of grains, beans, onions, and whatever greens the season provides. Occasionally, a slice of cheese, hard and salty, made from the milk of your own goats or cows. Meat is rare, reserved for feasts, though sometimes bacon or a rabbit caught in a snare may appear. On Fridays and during Lent, you eat fish if it is available, or simply more bread. Ale is a common drink, brewed at home in small batches. Water is not always safe, often carrying sickness, so ale weak and cloudy is the safer choice, even for children. Its taste is sour, its effect mild, but it is steady, reliable. The smell of it fills the hut as it ferments in wooden casks, mingling with the smoke of the hearth. The hearth itself is the center of existence. Here you cook, you gather, you warm your hands. The fire burns with wood if you are fortunate, but often it is dried peat or dung that fuels the flames. The smoke fills the room, escaping slowly through a hole in the roof or the cracks in the walls. Your eyes sting, your lungs grow heavy, but without the fire, there is no life. Above this domestic rhythm looms the figure of the Lord. The manor house, built of stone, rises like a silent reminder of your place in the order of things. You owe him rent, labor, obedience. On certain days you leave your own fields to work, his plowing, harvesting, repairing fences. These are your obligations, duties that cannot be refused. Failure brings fines, punishment, even eviction from the land you depend upon. You see the Lord from a distance, perhaps passing on horseback, cloaked in fine cloth. His life is one of abundance, of feasts, of comfort. Yours is not. You bow your head, you remove your cap, you step aside. There is no equality here, only hierarchy. You belong to the land, and the land belongs to him. The church, too, makes its claim. Tithes must be paid 1/10 of your produce, no matter how meager the harvest. Priests remind you that obedience in this life ensures salvation in the next. The weight of eternity hangs over every decision, every act of labor. Heaven and hell are not abstract ideas. They are the horizon toward which you walk every day. Even so, within these harsh realities, there are flickers of warmth. A child's laughter, a shared loaf of bread, a song sung in the fields as you work side by side. The moments are small, fleeting, but they are what make endurance possible. You hold on, because there is no other choice, and in that persistence lies a kind of quiet heroism. This is the world of the medieval peasant, a life stripped of luxury, bound by duty, shaped by forces beyond control. It is not the story of knights or kings, but of countless ordinary souls who lived and died unseen, carrying history forward on their tired backs. The life of a medieval peasant began with cries that echoed softly through the timber walls of a thatched hut. Birth itself was an uncertain affair. In villages scattered across Europe, the arrival of a new child was greeted with both joy and apprehension. A midwife, often an older woman who had seen many births, would be summoned. Her hands, practiced but untrained by anything we might call medicine, relied on tradition, whispered prayers, and herbs gathered from meadows and hedgerows. The hut would be dimly lit by a rushlight dipped in tallow, its faint flame throwing long shadows on the rough-hewn walls. A faint smell of damp straw mixed with the sharper scent of smoke from the hearth. For even in times of urgency, the fire was never allowed to die. Imagine yourself entering such a space. The air is thick, warm, and filled with murmurs. A woman labors on a straw mattress, her face damp with effort, while neighbors hover nearby. The sounds of pain are softened by the rhythm of whispered chants and Christian prayers. Others remnants of older folk customs that lingered stubbornly in rural memory. Survival was never guaranteed. Many mothers and infants were lost, their names never recorded, their graves marked only by a wooden cross, or sometimes nothing at all. Yet, when a child did survive, it was swiftly baptized. The church insisted that no soul should remain unbaptized, for sudden death lurked close. As infancy passed, the rhythm of survival continued. Children of peasants were not cushioned by toys or leisure. From the time they could toddle, they were drawn into the daily tasks of the household. Imagine a small boy, perhaps no more than 4, carrying a bundle of twigs in arms, too small for the burden. Picture a little girl, hair tangled and eyes wide with curiosity, shooing geese from a patch of grass or helping her mother stir a thin pottage that simmered over the fire. Their world was earthy and immediate, the smell of damp soil after rain, the rasp of wooden tools, the constant itch of coarse wool against skin. Food for children was little different from that of adults. They were fed on bread baked from barley or rye, often dense and dark. The bread might be dipped into broth flavored with leeks or cabbage, thickened with beans. On rare days, perhaps during festivals, a scrap of pork fat or a morsel of cheese brought variety. Sweetness was scarce. Honey was a luxury, and sugar was virtually unknown. A child might chew on apples in autumn or nuts gathered from the woods, but most of the year their diet was monotonous. Hunger was a familiar companion, shaping both body and spirit from the earliest years. Season by season, their bodies toughened. The rhythm of peasant life was written into the cycles of the year. Spring meant sowing, summer brought long hours in the fields, autumn demanded harvest, and winter was a season of waiting, conserving, and enduring. A child learned these rhythms not through books, but by imitation. They watched the older generation bend over furrows, saw their mothers spinning wool by the hearth, and heard the ever-present creak of wooden wheels or the grunt of oxen straining under plows. This education was relentless and practical, embedding in them a knowledge that was as old as the land itself. Illness was ever present. Coughs, fevers, rashes all were met with remedies passed down orally. A sprig of rosemary might be tied above a cradle. A poultice of herbs might be pressed against the skin. Sometimes these treatments offered relief, sometimes not. Death often stole into huts quietly, without drama. A child who was laughing one week might be buried the next, his absence noted in silence as the family continued its toil. Survival depended less on health than on sheer fortune, and the memory of lost siblings was carried quietly into adulthood. Despite hardship, moments of joy punctuated the bleakness. Children played with pebbles, bits of bone, or crude dolls made of rags and straw. They chased one another through meadows, their laughter ringing out across fields otherwise filled with the drone of labor. Festivals brought music, pipes and drums echoing through villages, bonfires crackling under the open sky. For children, these were times of wonder. Imagine standing in a crowd as the church bells tolled and dancers spun, while the smell of roasting meat drifted through the cool evening air. These were rare days when hunger loosened its grip and joy seemed possible. Religion shadowed every stage of life. From their earliest memory, children absorbed the sound of Latin chants, even if they did not understand the words. They were taught to cross themselves, to bow before crucifixes, and to fear sin. A priest's sermon, often stern and heavy with warnings, sank into impressionable minds. The idea of heaven and hell was not abstract, it was painted vividly on church walls, where frescoes showed angels lifting souls upward while demons dragged the condemned into flames. To a child, these images were terrifying, shaping their sense of a world where every action carried eternal weight. As childhood stretched into early youth, responsibilities increased. A boy might begin helping with the plow, guiding oxen with a stick, his feet sinking into damp soil. A girl might carry water from the village well, balancing a heavy bucket across uneven ground, the chill of the handle numbing her fingers in winter. Their bodies hardened early, calluses forming on hands not yet fully grown. There was no question of school for most. Only a handful of boys, usually those destined for the church, were taught to read and write. The rest learned only the language of work, land, and survival. Yet even in such narrow lives, dreams lingered. A child might gaze at a passing knight in gleaming armor, a figure out of reach, and wonder what it would be to live in such splendor. They might hear travelers speak of distant towns, markets bustling with goods, and imagine themselves escaping the boundaries of their fields. These dreams were often crushed by necessity, but for a fleeting moment, they brought color to otherwise gray horizons. Thus, the first years of a medieval peasant's life were a preparation for labor, endurance, and submission. They were shaped by hunger, by faith, by cold winters and fleeting summers. Each small detailed a scratch of woolen tunics, the taste of coarse bread, the toll of church bells was woven into the fabric of existence. Childhood was not a period set apart, but an early apprenticeship into survival, a quiet initiation into the ceaseless rhythm of toil. As a peasant child grew into early youth, the demands of the land grew heavier upon their shoulders. By the time a boy reached 12 or 13, his body was expected to bend under the same burdens as his father's. The calluses on his palms thickened, his back stooped early, and his days stretched from dawn to dusk. In summer, the sun rose long before he did, yet he would already be awake, urged from his bed of straw by the toll of the church bell or the insistent call of his parents. The air is heavy with dew, cool against your skin, while the earth smells rich and damp beneath your feet. You carry a crude wooden tool, perhaps a hoe or a flail, and you follow the line of adults who move slowly toward the horizon. Every step reminds you that your youth is brief. Laughter and games belong to small children. By this age, work is your daily language. For girls, responsibility arrived even sooner. By adolescence, a girl was expected to mirror her mother in every way. She spun wool with fingers that ached from repetition, kneaded dough for bread, and kept a constant watch over younger siblings. At the village well, she balanced heavy buckets of water across a yoke, her shoulders straining under the weight. Her body was not yet fully grown, but the demands of survival left no room for gentleness. The obligations of a medieval peasant family did not end with their own survival. Every village existed under the authority of a lord, and with that lord came obligations. Taxes were not optional, they were as much a part of life as hunger and cold. Some dues were paid in coin, though most peasants rarely handled money. Instead, payments were made in kind. A portion of grain harvested in autumn went directly into the lord's stores. Eggs, chickens, or pigs might be demanded. And always there were labor services, though when peasants were required to work on the lord's land instead of their own. Picture yourself bent over the soil, harvesting grain not for your own family, but for a distant master who may never even set foot in your village. The resentment was quiet, buried beneath centuries of habit, but it was there. You knew that no matter how much you sowed or reaped, a share would always be taken, leaving your family vulnerable in years of poor harvests. Famine was never far away. One failed season could mean the gnawing emptiness of winter, bellies bloated with hunger, prayers whispered into the silence of a cold hut. As adolescence gave way to adulthood, the next great step was marriage. For peasant boys and girls alike, marriage was not a choice of romance, but one of necessity. Villages were small, and the pool of potential partners limited. Cousins sometimes wed, not from affection, but from the need to consolidate land or labor. A wedding in a medieval village was simple yet deeply communal. The church provided a blessing, the priest standing before the couple in garments heavy with meaning. The air would smell faintly of incense, mixed with the ever-present scent of sweat and livestock drifting from outside. After the ceremony, there might be a feast. Do not imagine tables laden with delicacies. Instead, picture coarse bread, bowls of broth, perhaps a roasted pig shared among many. The ale flowed freely, thick and yeasty, and music echoed from rough pipes or drums beaten by eager hands. For one night, joy replaced hunger. Laughter and dancing filled the space where sorrow usually lingered. But soon enough, the celebration ended, and the new couple returned to the rhythm of toil. Their union cemented not just in love, but in shared survival. Children followed quickly. Mortality rates were high, and families often had many children in the hope that some would survive into adulthood. A young woman might find herself a mother by 15, her body still frail from years of labor and hunger. A young man, no older than 17 or 18, bore the weight of supporting not only his wife and children, but often his aging parents as well. Life pressed down with relentless force. The social structure of the village kept everyone in place. At the center stood the manor, whether a wooden hall or a stone castle where the lord or his steward resided. The village church rose nearby, its bell marking the hours of the day. Around these stood the peasant huts, their walls leaning and their roofs patched with straw. Within this small circle, the lives of peasants played out, bound by land and obligation. Rarely did anyone travel beyond the boundaries of their village. For most, the horizon they saw as children remained the horizon of their entire lives. Yet there was a kind of comfort in familiarity. The faces around you were the same from birth to death. You grew up beside children who became your neighbors in adulthood, who then became the elders you respected as age bent their bodies. Traditions repeated themselves year after year. Festivals for saints, holy days, and harvest celebrations brought light into the dark cycle of existence. A procession might weave through narrow lanes, banners fluttering, while villagers sang hymns that blended with the lowing of cattle. Still, the weight of obligation never lifted. Imagine a summer's day when the heat bears down heavily. You are in the fields, sweat running down your back, hands blistered from the scythe. Around you, others labor in silence, each absorbed in the endless work. You pause for a moment, looking toward the manor house where your lord lives in relative ease. The distance between your world and his is not merely physical but unbridgeable. His meals are richer, his clothes finer, his children educated. Yours will likely never know more than the boundaries of the plow and the church. In this way, adolescence slid seamlessly into adulthood. There was no sharp divide, no distinct threshold. Work, taxes, marriage, and children arrived gradually, blending into one another until life felt like a single, unbroken line of duty. Dreams of escape were rare and dangerous. For a peasant, to flee the village was to risk starvation, arrest, or worse. The ties that bound were not only legal, but also spiritual, reinforced by the church's teachings that to resist one eslot was to defy divine order. Thus, by the time a peasant reached their 20s, the arc of their life was already set. Their body bore the marks of labor, their spirit shaped by duty, and their future mapped out in furrows of soil. Each day mirrored the last, and each year brought the same cycle of sowing, reaping, and enduring. It was a life of quiet persistence, carried forward not by hope of change, but by the sheer momentum of survival. By the time a peasant reached full adulthood, perhaps in their 30s, the shape of their existence was firmly carved. Their hands, hardened into tools of labor, told the story of decades spent bending over fields. Their backs curved, not from age alone, but from the relentless rhythm of plowing, sowing, and reaping. In a world without clocks, their lives were timed by the sun and the seasons, each day a repetition of those that came before. At this stage, the obligations of manhood and womanhood deepened. A man was expected to provide for his household, not only feeding his family but ensuring that the Lord's share was met without fail. Taxes and rents loomed constantly, shadowing every harvest. Imagine the sinking of the stomach as you counted your sacks of grain, knowing that nearly half would be carried away to the Lord's barns or the church's tithe. What remained was meant to last until the next harvest, yet hunger often arrived long before the following summer. For women, adulthood was no lighter. Their work multiplied with the arrival of children. Dawn began not with the crow of a rooster, but with the cries of infants needing to be fed or soothed. They spun wool, churned butter, gathered herbs, and kept the hearth alive while their husbands and sons labored in the fields. The hut smelled of smoke, milk, and damp earth, and its single room echoed with the bustle of daily survival. Illness could strike suddenly. Childbirth, fevers, and infections claimed many young women. Those who lived grew older far more quickly than their years. The village itself was a tightly woven fabric. Neighbors relied on one another. At harvest, families joined forces, moving through fields in great lines, scythes rising and falling in unison. At building time, men helped one another raise walls of wattle and daub, the sound of hammers mingling with laughter. Yet disputes were inevitable. A cow straying into another man's patch of grain, a boundary line contested, or suspicions of theft could spark conflict. These quarrels were often settled at the manor court, presided over by a steward who dispensed judgments according to custom. Fines were paid in eggs, livestock, or coin when available. Disease was a constant shadow. Even before the great waves of plague that would devastate Europe, smaller outbreaks haunted villages. Dysentery, fevers, and skin diseases swept through huts where people and animals lived side by side. Imagine the helplessness as a cough deepened into fever, as skin turned pale and eyes lost their brightness. Remedies were simple. Garlic hung in doorways, prayers muttered by priests, charms tied to the wrist. Some survived, many did not. Graves filled steadily, often without ceremony. Life continued, because it had to. The church was the anchor through it all. Adults attended Mass weekly, kneeling on cold stone floors, their eyes fixed on flickering candles and painted saints. The sermons were heavy with reminders of sin and salvation, reinforcing obedience to both God and Lord. Festivals offered rare relief, blending sacred and communal joy. Bells rang, villagers carried banners, and for a brief time, food and drink were shared more generously. Ale loosened tongues, songs rose into the night, and laughter carried across the field. These moments of reprieve reminded peasants that life was not only suffering, but also shared humanity. As adults aged, their roles shifted. Men whose strength waned often guided younger workers, their voices raspy but steady as they taught when to plant and when to reap. Women too old for heavy labor continued to spin wool or tend children, their stories and prayers shaping the rhythms of the hearth. The sight of an elder sitting by the fire, eyes reflecting years of toil, carried a quiet authority. Yet old age was a rare gift. Few lived beyond their 50s, and those who did bore the marks of hardship. Their faces were deeply lined, their teeth often gone, their bodies bent and frail. Still, they carried memories of decades past, poor harvests, bitter winters, and fleeting festivals. You know your days are numbered, yet you find solace in the rhythm of the land that continues beyond your time. Death was not feared in silence but woven into the very fabric of daily life. Funerals were simple, marked by the toll of a bell and the slow procession to the churchyard. Bodies were wrapped in cloth, lowered into earth, and covered with soil. Prayers promised eternal rest, though doubts lingered in the minds of many. For the survivors, grief was quiet and private. Fields still needed tending, animals still needed care. Life continued, as it always had, indifferent to the passing of individuals. The legacy of adulthood for a medieval peasant was not written in books or carved in monuments. It was etched into the soil they tilled, into the children they raised, and into the traditions they passed forward. Their names might be forgotten, their faces lost to time, but the rhythm of their lives built the foundation of entire societies. Every handful of grain, every stone laid, every prayer whispered in a smoky church carried the weight of countless unseen lives. Each generation bore the same hardships, repeated the same rituals, and dreamed the same quiet dreams. The weight was heavy, but in its own way, it was steadying. Their world, for all its hardship, was constant, reliable in its cycles. To live as a peasant was to endure, and to endure was its own form of triumph. The medieval peasant's inner world was shaped as much by faith and fear as by the soil beneath their feet. To understand their existence, you must step into a village where the church spire dominates the skyline, where bells toll not only for prayer but for every rhythm of daily life. Religion was not simply a part of their world, it was the world. Each morning, peasants crossed themselves before labor, muttering prayers for strength and protection. They believed angels and saints walked unseen among them, guiding their steps and defending them against the snares of evil. Yet alongside this faith was constant fear, the fear of damnation, of sin committed unknowingly, of punishments that awaited in the afterlife. Sermons painted vivid images of hellfire and eternal suffering, etching terror into minds already burdened by earthly hardship. The church demanded obedience not only to God but also to earthly authorities. Priests preached loyalty to the Lord, obedience to custom, and humility in all things. For the peasant, rebellion against their station was not merely dangerous, it was sinful. The weight of this teaching pressed down on them, binding them as tightly as chains of iron. Superstition mingled seamlessly with faith. A crow's cry at dawn might foretell sickness. A strange mark on a newborn's skin was whispered to be the devil's touch. People wore charms, hung herbs, and said prayers to ward off witches. The line between sacred and magical was blurred. Both were weapons against the unknown. The nights brought their own terrors. In the dim glow of a hearth fire, stories passed from mouth to mouth, tales of restless spirits, of wolves that prowled in near, of figures glimpsed in the fields when the moon was full. Children huddled close to their mothers, eyes wide, ears filled with stories that were half warning, half entertainment. For the adult listening, such tales were more than amusement. They were reminders of a world filled with unseen dangers, a fragile veil separating the known from the unknown. And so, peasants lived in constant negotiation between hope and dread. Hope that prayers would bring rain or sun at the right time, that saints would guard their children through sickness, that the Virgin's mercy would soften their suffering. Dread that misfortune was punishment for sins, that failure to pay tithes might invite divine wrath, that demons lurked in shadows waiting for a soul unguarded. This duality, faith as comfort, fear as change, shaped every moment of their lives. Beyond physical toil, the medieval peasant bore a heavier weight, the burden of guilt. Priests reminded them weekly that mankind was sinful by nature. Every misstep, every harsh word, every idle thought could be counted against them in the judgment to come. For peasants, who already carried the ache of hunger and labor, this invisible burden was perhaps the heaviest of all. Confession offered release, yet it also reinforced the cycle. Kneeling before a priest, peasants whispered scenes into the darkness, hearts pounding with fear of exposure. The absolution that followed was relief, but brief. Soon enough, guilt returned, woven into the rhythm of daily living. The rituals of the church gave peasants structure in a chaotic world. Baptisms, marriages, funerals, all were marked by sacred rites. These ceremonies reminded peasants that their lives, however small, were linked to something eternal. Standing in a church filled with incense and the echo of chants, they might feel a fleeting sense of transcendence, a glimpse beyond the mud and toil of daily existence. Yet questions lingered. Why did the innocent child die while the cruel neighbor lived to old age? Why did God allow famine, disease, and war to sweep through the land? Such doubts were dangerous, seldom spoken aloud, but they lived quietly in the hearts of many. The official answer was simple: suffering was God's will, a test of faith, or punishment for sin. But in the silence of their huts, peasants sometimes wondered if there was more. Legends and folktales became outlets for these unspoken doubts. Stories of heroes who rose from nothing, of saints who defended the weak, of hidden treasures that could lift a family from poverty or carried whispers of hope. Around the fire, peasants dreamed of worlds beyond their own, if only for a night. The search for meaning was not always grand. Sometimes it was found in the small things, in the laughter of children chasing each other through dusty lanes, in the taste of bread on feast days, in the brief warmth of summer evenings. For peasants who had so little, these fleeting joys became sacred. In the end, the inner life of a peasant was as complex as that of any king. They prayed, they feared, they doubted, they dreamed. Their voices may be lost to history, but their struggles remain deeply human echoes of the same questions we ask today. Sleep was not always a refuge for the medieval peasant. After a day of backbreaking work, they collapsed onto straw beds, but rest often carried them into darker realms. Dreams were not seen as random illusions of the mind, they were messages, warnings, even prophecies. A dream of a withered crop could send a family into panic, believing famine was near. A vision of a saint or angel might inspire pilgrimage, no matter how impossible the journey. Nightmares held particular terror. To awaken drenched in sweat after seeing a shadowy figure or burning fire was to believe the devil had visited. Many peasants kept charms near their beds: a sprig of rosemary, a cross carved into wood, a pouch of salt tied to the bed frame. These small acts of protection were lifelines against a world they could neither control nor fully understand. The imagination of peasants was fueled by the stories that surrounded them. They did not read books, for most were illiterate. but they lived stories. Priests thundered tales of saints and martyrs from the pulpit, shaping their understanding of virtue and punishment. Minstrels carried news and legends from distant towns, weaving history and fantasy together. Around the fire, elders recited folk tales of giants that roamed hills, of maidens trapped in enchanted towers, of devils that could be tricked by clever peasants. For a people with little freedom in reality, imagination was both escape and weapon. Children, wide-eyed, absorbed these tales as moral lessons. Adults, hardened by toil, clung to them as reminders that even in a world of suffering, there might be magic or justice lurking unseen. And yet, imagination could be cruel. To believe that illness was caused by sin, or that a failed harvest meant divine punishment, added layers of guilt to already heavy burdens. The invisible world of spirits, saints, demons, and angels pressed down as hard as the visible weight of hunger and labor. The medieval peasant lived not only in mud and wood, but in a landscape of symbols, dreams, and fears. In this unseen realm, their minds roamed far beyond the fields into heaven, into hell, and into every shadow in between. If there is one thing rarely written in chronicles, it is silence, the silence of millions of peasants who never recorded their thoughts, who lived entire lives unspoken by history. But silence itself tells us much. Peasants often kept their doubts, frustrations, and anger hidden. To criticize the church openly was dangerous. To complain too loudly about a lord's demands could invite punishment. So thoughts were swallowed, buried beneath layers of obedience. In the privacy of huts, whispers emerged, doubts about justice, fears of eternal damnation, quiet resentment toward those who lived in ease while they suffered. But such whispers rarely left the walls of their homes. Secrets were part of survival. Families sometimes hid extra grain from the tithe collector, praying they would not be discovered. Husbands and wives concealed feelings of despair from each other, not wanting to burden the family further. Women carried private knowledge of herbs to ease childbirth, of charms to protect infants, of ways to resist when life became unbearable. These secrets formed a hidden culture, passed from mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, often invisible to authorities. Silence was not always weakness. At times it was resistance. Refusing to speak, refusing to confess certain doubts, refusing to bow too deeply, these were quiet rebellions. They could not rise up with weapons, but they could guard the sanctity of their inner lives. Small sparks of independence within a system designed to crush them. And yet, silence also meant erasure. The voices of peasants were not written in parchment or preserved in chronicles. Their laughter, their curses, their lullabies, their laments all vanished with the wind. We reconstruct their world only from fragments. Tax records, sermons, court cases, the occasional note in a noble's account book. What remains missing are their own words, their own truths. In that silence lies the greatest tragedy of all. Not the hunger, not the labor, not even the fear of damnation, but the fact that their stories were never told. Imagine for a moment that you are no longer in a peasant's mud-walled hut, but stepping across the polished floors of a great medieval hall. The ceilings are high, beams carved with patterns of leaves and lions. Torches line the walls, their smoke caught in the rafters, their flames casting a golden glow across tapestries that depict knights in battle, saints in radiant glory, and rulers crowned with authority. For peasants who never came close to such places, this world was as distant as heaven itself. The noble banquet was the very opposite of peasant survival, where peasants measured every crumb of bread and prayed their grain would last the winter. Lords displayed excess as a sign of power. The long central table was crowded with dishes: roasted boar, venison, swan, and goose. Platters gleamed with glazed fruits imported from distant lands, figs, dates, even oranges that peasants could only imagine from stories of faraway markets. Great loaves of fine white bread, soft and fragrant, sat at every place, so different from the coarse rye eaten in the village. The food was not only nourishment, it was theater. Whole animals were presented with golden leaves pinned to their skins, peacocks roasted and then dressed again in their iridescent feathers, even pies that released live birds when cut open. Every dish reminded guests of the Lord's wealth, his reach across markets and trade routes, his ability to summon abundance where others had none. Wine flowed as steadily as water in a river, not the sour thin ale of peasants, but deep red vintages carried from vineyards of France or Italy. Silver goblets and golden cups clinked as toasts echoed. Music swelled from minstrels seated in the corner, lutes, harps, and voices rising together in songs that praised the Lord, celebrated the feast, and filled the hall with rhythm. To sit at such a table was not simply to eat, it was to be reminded of order, of rank, of who belonged where in the hierarchy of medieval life. Lords sat at the high table, nearest to the fire, their places marked by rich cloths and cushions. Lesser guests sat further down, each seat a visible sign of status. Even within the feast, everyone knew their place. For peasants who heard rumors of such gatherings, the imagination could scarcely comprehend the scale. To think of bread enough for everyone, of meat more than once or twice a year, of honey cakes, sugared almonds, spiced sauces, it was to dream of another world. And indeed, it was another world, one most would never enter. But the banquets were not simply indulgence. They were performances of stability. At the Lord's table, abundance meant authority. Every guest who ate and drank left reminded of the power at the center of the hall. A banquet in a medieval hall was never just a meal. It was, above all, a declaration. To gather dozens or even hundreds of guests around a single table, to offer them endless courses, to entertain them with music and spectacle, these were acts of deliberate power. The noble knew that food was memory. A guest who bit into tender roasted venison would remember not only the flavor, but also the Lord who provided it. Every sip of wine reminded them that the resources to import such a drink belonged only to the ruling household. A feast whispered and, sometimes shouted, "I can provide what others cannot. I command plenty while others struggle." Political alliances were sealed in such halls. Think of a visiting knight, arriving weary from the road. He is seated at the high table, served with golden plates and steaming dishes. The warmth of hospitality softens him, makes him more open to agreements, oaths, or pledges of loyalty. In a world where survival was uncertain, a lord who could offer abundance proved his competence as protector. Even the order of service was symbolic. The lord might be presented first with a dish as grand as a whole roasted ox, carried by servants in ceremonial dress. Behind him, seated guests would wait their turn, reminded visually of their lesser station. Every act reinforced the hierarchy. Who was honored first? Who ate the choicest cuts? Who drank from silver instead of pewter? Luxury was not only for the senses of taste and smell, but also for the eyes. The hall became a theater of magnificence. Candles blazed in iron chandeliers, polished until they reflected the light back 100-fold. Tapestries glowed with color, depicting battles won and saints watching. Even the salt cellars containers for that precious mineral were shaped like miniature castles or carved beasts, tokens of extravagance that peasants could hardly imagine. These items spoke loudly to all who entered. Wealth here is solid, enduring, unshakable. Salt itself, valuable and scarce, was more than a seasoning, it was a sign of permanence. To place a guest above the salt was to honor them, while those seated below the salt knew their lesser value. Such phrases survive even into modern speech, a shadow of these medieval customs. But beneath the glittering surface was calculation. Each guest's seat, each course, each performance of music was chosen carefully. A guest placed closer to the Lord might feel flattered, their loyalty secured. Another seated further away might feel slighted, a subtle reminder of their need to prove themselves. The banquet was as much chessboard as dining table. Consider also the entertainments woven between courses, jugglers tossing knives, minstrels singing tales of heroes, or even trained animals performing tricks. These diversions delighted the senses, but they also communicated a message. Our household has leisure. We are not pressed by hunger or fear. We can afford to laugh while others labor. The very act of distraction was political, a sign that the ruling class controlled not only land and labor, but also time itself. It was also common for the church to bless such gatherings, weaving divine approval into the feast. Priests gave prayers, offered scripture, and tied abundance to heaven's favor. This laid another meaning upon the table. God had smiled upon the Lord, and by extension, upon all who served him. To eat at such a feast was to be reminded that resisting the order of things might be resisting divine will itself. For peasants who might glimpse only rumors of such occasions, the contrast was dizzying. While they counted handfuls of barley, their lords measured abundance in roasted birds and barrels of imported wine. Yet for the nobles, these feasts were not mere indulgence. They were survival of another kind. Without them, power would weaken, alliances would fracture, and when the last song ended and the final goblets of wine were drained, the noble banquet began to dissolve into silence. Servants moved quickly, clearing platters stacked with bones, carrying away trenchers soaked with saucers, sweeping crumbs from the long tables. The glow of fire dimmed. The smoke hung heavier, and what had been a glittering performance only hours earlier became an echo of noise and light. But for many, the true story of the feast began only after the guests had left. The scraps, the crusts of bread, the bones stripped of most meat, the leftover pies and fruits were carried out into the kitchens and the yards. Here, servants, scullions, and sometimes even the poor at the gates waited. To them, these remains were treasures. A crust of fine white bread, even hardened, tasted better than the coarse rye of the fields. A piece of roasted fowl, overlooked by nobles, was a luxury beyond measure. It was common for lords to distribute leftovers to the poor as an act of charity. But this too had meaning. Generosity became another show of power. To hand out fragments of the feast was to remind peasants who had provided them, whose abundance trickled down, and whose hand fed them. Even in scraps, hierarchy spoke. Imagine a hungry child at the edge of the manor, clutching a piece of sweet pastry, its sugar a rare delight. For that child, the Lord's feast was not distant but immediate, a taste of a world unreachable, yet present in crumbs. The sweetness lingered not only on the tongue but in memory, reinforcing the gulf between everyday hunger and occasional miracle. For peasants who never entered the hall, the stories of the feast carried almost as much weight as the feast itself. News of the abundance spread through villages. How many courses were served, what strange animals had been roasted, how bright the silver shone. These tales passed from mouth to mouth, growing with each telling, turning the feast into legend. A swan served whole became, in memory, 100 swans. A cup of wine became rivers of it. The distance between truth and imagination widened, but so too did the AW award the noble household. At the same time, there was resentment. For every peasant who marveled at the tales, another felt bitterness. How could one household consume so much while others struggled to fill their pots with thin broth? The feast symbolized plenty, but also inequality. The nobility's abundance was built upon the labor of fields, the taxes collected, and the relentless toil of peasants whose own tables stayed bare. In the hush after a feast, the manor hall bore traces of excess. Grease stains on the table, pools of wax hardened into the wood, half-burnt torches. These signs reminded servants of the scale of labor required to stage such a performance. Dozens had worked unseen to make the abundance possible: hunters, cooks, brewers, bakers, washerwomen, stable boys, woodcutters. The feast was not only a spectacle of wealth, but also a concentration of countless hidden hands. Yet, in the greater picture, the end of the banquet reinforced the rhythm of medieval life. Just as peasants returned daily to their fields, so too did lords return to order and governance. The feast could not last forever. Soon, accounts would be tallied, disputes settled, and land managed once again. The hall grew quiet, awaiting the next occasion when music and abundance would return. For peasants, the memory of such events was a paradox. On one hand, it was proof that their lords were strong, blessed, and capable of offering stability. On the other, it was a painful reminder of their own hunger and toil. The glow of torches in the hall might seem a faint light in the distance, unreachable yet always present, reminding them of the boundaries of their world. The medieval feast, in its glitter and its excess, was therefore never just about eating. It was about contrast. It was about showing, again and again, the separation between those who labored in the soil and those who ruled over it. And when the music faded and the hall emptied, that truth remained, etched into memory like the scent of smoke that lingered in the rafters. Alti would slip away.